This is Space Minds by SpaceNews. In this week's episode of Space Minds, host David Ariosto speaks with Steve Kitay, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, former head of Microsoft's Space Initiatives, and now Senior Vice President for Space Defense at True Anomaly.
Steve Kitay, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. Then you went on to Microsoft, and now you're Senior Vice President of Space Defense at True Anomaly. It's a pleasure to have you on the pod.
David, thank you so much for having me here. Excited for the conversation.
I am too, and I really wanted to talk to you because I think your background really speaks to kind of like the nature of where the space industry is going, because you have policy perspective, you have defense perspective, you've got tech perspective in Silicon Valley, and now you're at True Anomaly, which is sort of a relatively new space startup that's kind of at this intersection of space defense, situational awareness, growing startups, newfound commercial interest, venture capital, like all of this is kind of coalescing in this really interesting way. And I think True Anomaly is sort of like a great sort of case study in terms of how we look at this. But like first, let's get into you. It's like what drew you into the private sector after this long career at the Pentagon and elsewhere?
So, David, I've been really fortunate in my career. I feel like it was a lot of luck and timing and a lot of great people that I got to work with, and could have never planned out this path, but it's been a really exciting one. I spent 18 years in the government, starting active duty in the military, and then eventually, as you said, serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy in the Pentagon. So kind of went from very hands-on to the strategic level. And then in 2020, I left and went into industry. And my desire to go to industry was really to go build and create capabilities that serve our nation and support our warfighters. And it's such an exciting time with the technology, insofar as how much it's advancing, that I wanted to get out there, get my hands dirty, and really create those capabilities for the future.
When you think about the nature of space in the space industry and sort of like the intersection of geopolitical players, I mean, you could date back all the way to the 1960s, and this has always been sort of a geopolitical question and contest ever since the days of Sputnik, and sort of some of the driving motivations behind the Apollo program and race to the moon. But it's different now in terms of like the scope of how many commercial players are vying in the sort of that competitive space, not least of which by virtue of the technology making access to space more accessible, reusable technologies and dropping launch costs. But the nature of space as sort of this warfighting domain is considerably different than it used to be. And I'm wondering how your perspective on space security has sort of evolved over time since the days you were at the Department of Defense to now.
So it's a really interesting point. And the space, one of the common misconceptions is people sometimes say, well, space is getting militarized now. And space has been militarized since the very beginning. The original launch of Sputnik in 1957, of course, was done by the Soviets. We quickly responded with Explorer in 1958, which was actually a US Army program. So the military was involved in space since the very beginning for communications, for reconnaissance, and really for supporting our nation. Now, in addition, it's international, it's exploration, and it is an element of really international prestige when looking at nations competing on the geopolitical landscape. And you certainly saw that happening with the Apollo program and Kennedy and putting a person, first man on the moon in 1969. What ended up evolving over those period of years is space became more and more integral to warfare. And then what changed in the past really 10 years is space becoming truly a warfighting domain, where it's not just services that are providing capabilities to soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, but a warfighting domain in and of its own right, where we are competing in space insofar as the need to be able to protect and defend our interests in space, because there's so many threats that are, China and Russia in particular recognize how important space is to us, started developing weapon systems. As a result, we had to ensure we developed the capabilities to be able to protect and defend, as well as be able to deny an adversary the use of space if they're using it hostile to our interests. That's kind of what's changing over the past 10 years.
And we saw that. We saw that with Ukraine, right? I mean, we saw that just the advent and that sort of that nexus of sort of commercial and public interest with Starlink, and how that sort of played out in real time in the battlefields. I think what's different though is that when you look at what's happening on orbit, in the past, we kept track of these things by virtue of telescopes and other sensors. And generally, satellites tried just to kind of avoid each other. I don't know that there was a lot more than that in terms of what was taking place, but now you almost, and this maybe speaks to True Anomaly's Jackal program. It speaks to this nature of those almost orbit policing spacecraft that are now actively looking for suspicious activity. And the nature of space as a warfighting domain, yes, very much in terms of just the fog of war component that can be thrown down on the battlefields in places like Ukraine, but also actually as an environment itself for kinetic activity. I wonder if you can address that portion.
David, that's right. And I'll speak a bit to the True Anomaly piece in particular here, as you mentioned. So we spoke about this transformation to really it being a warfighting domain where the United States needs to be able to protect and defend its interests. It's the US and its allies and partners globally. Now, the first step in protecting and defending interests in space is understanding what's happening in space and the threats that we face to our space systems. Now, historically, the way that we've typically done that is through sensors on the ground, through telescopes, through radars that are looking at what's happening in space. Now, we will continue to need those capabilities. In addition to that, we need capabilities in space that are able to characterize and understand at a much deeper level what's actually happening on orbit with different spacecraft. Because, of course, all of this activity is happening thousands of miles away, sometimes up to 23,000 miles away, which is geosynchronous orbit. So the ability to have low-cost, highly maneuverable systems that are able to characterize and understand what's happening in space, that's where True Anomaly fits in. We're a space superiority company building defense technologies to enable our nation to protect and defend our interests in, from, and through space. Our Jackal spacecraft is our first product, a satellite system that's designed to do rendezvous and proximity operations. That means to go up.
Explain that a little bit, like how that actually works. What is this spacecraft doing specifically? I gave it like a little bit of a primer, but I want to hear from you.
Absolutely. So if you start with thinking about satellites going up to other satellites. So, for example, when we send astronauts into space, for instance, SpaceX has their Dragon capsule that goes up to the International Space Station. That's doing rendezvous and proximity operations and ultimately docking with the International Space Station. Now, that's a cooperative asset. That's an asset that they're both ours, and we are going up and then bringing that very careful maneuver. Now, the ability to do non-cooperative rendezvous and proximity operations at a safe distance where we're understanding what's happening with other systems is really what True Anomaly is building out. So we're not trying to go up to the International Space Station. We're trying to give the capabilities to the US government, the allies and partners, where they are able to have a low-cost, highly maneuverable set of capabilities that enables them to highly characterize what's happening in space. The challenge is, and there have been capabilities over time. For instance, the Space Force today has a program called GSAP. In the future, they're looking at a new competition that they're calling RGXX, where you think of reconnaissance, geosynchronous orbit, XX, there's a number. So they're moving more towards typical military nomenclature, where you think of an F-15, where it's a fighter 15 or a B-2, a bomber 2 in Air Force. You can see they're moving towards more military nomenclature as they're building out their systems. But what they need in the future is systems that can't necessarily take days and weeks to respond, but they can very quickly respond with a higher number of assets.
You said a lot there, right? And so I think I want to unpack a couple of those things. So first, just maybe the latency question of operating in geosynchronous in terms of having a lot of raw data that is being collected that has to be used and operationalized in real time, especially when you were talking about new speeds, the advent of hypersonics, particularly among U.S. adversaries, namely China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the nature of autonomous systems in response to those threats. And you talked about the distance, so I kind of want to get into that before we sort of get into sort of maybe what's driving a lot of this vis-a-vis Beijing. But speak to me a little bit about that and maybe the growing nature of infrastructure in space itself to be almost like this. In some ways, it almost seems like this new factory floor that's in orbit. And when you have the military using terms that are classified for traditional operations terrestrially, there is a certain normalization of this, and where like the I don't want to describe this as sort of orbital dogfighting, but I mean we're kind of moving into an arena where you have the potential for more kinetic activity, and yet the speeds, and I think this is maybe the critical question, the speeds by which these things are operating, and the reliance on autonomous systems. It seems like it's going to require more data, more processing on orbit, edge, that sort of thing. I'm just like wondering how that's being incorporated into what True Anomaly is doing.
That's exactly right, David. Autonomy is going to be key to the future. I've mentioned Jackal, which is our spacecraft, a highly maneuverable rendezvous proximity operation spacecraft. That is then tied to our second product, which is called Mosaic. Mosaic is the software system that is the ground software to command and control, as well as being integrated with our flight system. Now, it's not only command and control, but it's the ability to do battle management, to understand what's happening in space, to be able to plan, prepare, and then execute operations. And in particular, what's really important for the future is autonomous operations. The speed of capabilities insofar as these threats that we're facing in space in a dynamic range of systems, we need to ensure that we're able to respond on operationally relevant timelines. And when I say we, I'm saying our nation, and ultimately True Anomaly looking to provide those capabilities to our military to be able to respond very rapidly.
It's
Autonomy. Oh,
just like
please.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just to that point, like sort of the nature of sort of wargaming, data analytics, digital twin technologies, the sort of the predictive mindset that's sort of going into sort of what this new arena looks like is baked into this sort of public-private partnership in a way that I don't know that we've seen in the past. And I was wondering if you could maybe fold that kind of observation into sort of this new paradigm within the market. This is not to say that commercial players haven't existed up there. Certainly they have. Boeing has been around since the days of Apollo. But it's different now with regard to like the advancing technologies and how that marries with a sort of government policy perspective. And you're really uniquely situated to see both because you've kind of sat in both seats.
David, this is something I'm extremely excited about in a very, very unique moment that we're at. And we talked about this change from really the early days of going into space in the 1950s and 1960s to then a warfighting domain. And what really happened, if I unpack that a little bit more, is particularly over the past 10 years, is the first step that you started seeing happening was this increased commercial activity in space. Billions and billions of dollars coming in to provide communications capabilities, to provide sensor capabilities, and be able to leverage what's happening in space, not only for governments, but commercial activities. The new step that's happening just within the past couple of years is now this advent of what I would say defense technology and defense product. What I mean by that is commercial activities are building capabilities for a broad commercial base that serves governments, but also commercial customers. That's important, but what that is not doing is necessarily building the unique capabilities that our military needs. When I say that, the Army does not go onto the battlefield with a Toyota Camry, they go with the tank. When the Air Force goes into air-to-air combat, they need fighter aircraft to be able to do that mission. The point is there are unique defense needs. So what's happened over the past couple years is billions of dollars of private investment are now flowing into this market to build what I would call defense product. What defense product is companies like ours, True Anomaly. I'm here at our factory floor in Denver, Colorado. We call Gravity Works. We've got 30,000 square feet of capability here. We've got another 90,000 square feet in Los Angeles, where we're building out our satellites and software at scale. That's building out product. And we're building those products specifically to meet defense needs. Now, the requirement there is, to your point, it really has to be this public-private partnership of working together to enable the capabilities.
I wonder what's driving it from your perspective, because I mean, if you look at, sort of the joke in Washington is that you're starting to have like Golden Dome catering companies, right? Like everyone is trying to kind of fall into this spigot that's been potentially opened with regard to sort of the nature of security funding and how the Golden Dome sort of fits into this, which is still somewhat ill-defined in terms of like its scope, some existing programs, some new programs, new technologies that are coming to bear. But technology is only one part of it, right? I mean, you have new capabilities in terms of cyber, new capabilities in terms of hypersonics, new sort of growing adversaries in terms of Beijing, and already operational posturing and frankly, use of some of these technologies on the battlefield in Ukraine with Russia. And it does seem like the globe is shrinking a little bit in terms of how close we are with regard to how quickly these new technologies can affect each other, potentially devastatingly. But I wonder like how that's shifted and this sort of new emphasis in terms of the funding, the policy making, and where sort of defense-minded. When we talk about situational awareness, in many cases, we're talking about military applications of situational awareness. And I'm just wondering when that pivot happened from your perspective.
To me, it's very clear two things are driving this change. Number one is the threat. The threat is the pacing challenge to ensure that we, the United States, are able to maintain international peace and security and the democratic values that we look as the future of the globe. There are others in the global geopolitical world order, namely China and Russia, that have different views of what the world should look like and how we move forward. China, in particular, is investing rapidly on their defense capabilities to try and challenge what we can do. If I look at space alone and I look at the past 10 years, they have put up 1,000 satellites into space. Now, we've done even more than that and are leading the way, but the change is really the rate of their acceleration is extremely rapid to contest us and our ability to maintain essentially supremacy in these domains from a military point of view.
And
That's number one.
and from a long-term perspective as well, I mean, if you just look at at least the publicly available R&D numbers when it comes to where that spending is going within Beijing, but also that sort of fundamental science, that basic research that may not have a market now, but potentially will in 10 years, 15 years. That their numbers, I mean, you look at them, they've doubled just in the last couple of years and seem to be on this sort of upward trajectory. And so I wonder if you can kind of like take maybe a step back a little bit and think about sort of that policy perspective that you had when you were at DoD and marry that with some of your experience now in the commercial sector. And like when you look at the future of deterrence in space, and you're not thinking about 2026 where you have a lot going on, but you're thinking about 2030, 2035, 2050, where certainly the Chinese have made public some of these plans that extend all the way out to that far. I wonder what it looks like. I wonder what the whole arena looks like in terms of the amount of machines that are up there, the the political interactions. I mean, some of this is just unknowable, but some of this you can see trajectories. And so I just wonder like what your vantage is.
That is really the crux of the second point, David, which is I'd talked about the threats. The second point is the pace of our acquisition system in the United States, specifically the defense enterprise, to be able to deliver those capabilities to our warfighters is ultimately failing.
Mm.
And it's not moving at the pace needed to get the innovation out to the warfighters at what they need. It's not only 2030, 2035, it's 2026, 2027. And the reason why it's so important to be able to get what the warfighters need is to maintain deterrence. To your point, ultimately, what we're trying to do as a nation is maintain that peace for another hour, another day, another month, another year to ensure that nations are resolving their differences through political means, talking across the aisle, and not violent means. But we know that that doesn't always happen. You reference Ukraine and what's happening there. Unfortunately, that is taking place through military means, and hopefully we're able as a nation to find political, peaceful means to resolve a conflict like that. Now, a company like True Anomaly fits into that overall equation that we just talked about because we are able, with the private investment that we are getting, to be able to move rapidly to build these capabilities uniquely needed for the military, partner with them, and field them rapidly. So when I look to the future is going to be more activity in space, frankly, likely more competition. And I think that it will be a mix of commercial, military, exploration needs, and we're going to see more and more happening from this domain, really being an essential element of how we are projecting power. And Golden Dome is an excellent example of that, David. What the administration has put out is the use of space-based interceptors. This is a fascinating approach insofar as looking at how much space technology has changed since the original Reagan SDI program to ensure that we're able to protect and defend our interests as a nation, leveraging these new technologies. I think it's really exciting. There's terrific leaders at the helm. There's an industry across the board that's looking and chomping at the bit to help our nation ensure that we field the technologies at scale and at needed. And I think it's really an incredible time to be in this business.
Do you think, because I mean, I have to play devil's advocate a little bit on this, like if in terms of putting space-based interceptors up there and, you know, increasing kinetic activity or potential kinetic means, um, there is, you know, a danger of it sort of creating this sort of self-fulfilling loop in which it becomes a bit more of an arms race in terms of what's happening in orbit, or has that already happened? And now it's just a matter of creating that sense of deterrence because it's not just a race, right? There are consequences to falling behind that have real world implications terrestrially. So I'm curious, like how you square those two kind of considerations.
So I'm no longer a government official. I'm in industry looking to build the capabilities that the government says it needs, but I would look to products that the US government has put out. So for instance, the Defense Intelligence Agency has unclassified, put out there what the threats to our nation is from a missile perspective. You only need to look at one chart like that they put out unclassified that shows what China and Russia are building now and building over the next 5 to 10 years. And if you're wondering if there's any sort of competition that's going on right now, that will answer it very clearly for you, that you will see the thousands of missiles across multiple classes that are being designed to threaten US and allied interests across the globe. So we have to recognize what's out there, and that's where it goes back to, I believe, fundamentally deterrence and an element of having peace through strength. And how True Anomaly fits in that is supporting our military, providing the capabilities that they say they're going to need, and doing it very fast with the best technologies.
All right, so last question. Last question is going to kind of be a bit of a little bit of two-parter in terms of one, it's going to put your philosophical hat on in terms of what we had. Two, also sort of the perspective that True Anomaly has in this sort of new arena. I'm just wondering, like, what keeps you up at night when it comes to like the nature of this new paradigm, whether it's space debris, whether it's the nature of adversaries, whether it's miscalculations. And then from a true anomaly perspective, where's the opportunity? Like where do you see this fitting in? I mean, you've answered a lot of it now, but I mean, I think that like that's a dual track here that kind of makes sense in many ways to kind of wrap this up.
I'll tell you what keeps me up at night, and it's interesting. Dr. Troy Mink is the Secretary of the Air Force, and he just spoke this week at the Air Force Symposium or the Air Force Association event, and he talked about being a Sputnik moment, and a moment such that we as a nation need to be aware of the threats that we're facing. When Sputnik happened, the nation recognized and mobilized to ensure that we maintained our technological edge.
Mm.
He called and said that we're at that moment right now. What concerns me is, does our nation realize that? Now, clearly, the leaders in the Defense Department and guiding our government realize that, but we need the broader public to realize that too, to ensure that they are supporting these efforts to ensure that we move rapidly to develop the capabilities to maintain that deterrence. So it's ensuring that the system adapts and the bureaucracy doesn't stall things. That's what keeps me up at night. Now, I will tell you, the leaders I see in place are leaders that want to move rapidly and are changing the system, and I have faith in them. And that's where True Anomaly fits in, is we will partner with these leaders at the top all the way through the sergeant and the lieutenants at the bottom and work with them to provide them the capabilities we need and as a nation. And I'm excited about that. That's, that's what's ultimately we're doing. And I continue to look forward for us to scale that even more to provide more impact for our nation.
All right. I think that's a good place to leave it. Steve Kitay, Senior Vice President of Space Defense at True Anomaly. Thanks so much for joining us here on Space Minds.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.